The fine was taped to my front door like some kind of trophy. Bright yellow paper, bold red lettering, violation $150 for lawn debris. I stared at it, confused for a second, then looked over at my lawn. A few curled, golden leaves scattered across the grass, nothing major. Certainly nothing worth $150, I muttered. You've got to be kidding me, and yanked the paper off. My name's Quinton Vale. I'm a respiratory therapist, 12-hour shifts, back-to-back, no time for drama. I moved into this neighborhood for peace and quiet. What I got instead was Karen Delaney Crow, self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association. She was the type who patrolled the cul-de-sac in her golf cart, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched like she was guarding the gates of Buckingham Palace. Her hair was always too stiff, her voice just a little too loud, and she had an uncanny ability to find problems where there weren't any. I wasn't even inside yet when I heard that voice behind me. Quinton. Got your notice, I hope. Karen stood at the edge of my driveway, holding that same clipboard like it was a badge. Yeah, I got it, I said, holding up the fine. Leaves on the lawn, seriously, she clicked her tongue. The HOA guidelines are very clear. All yards must be free of visible debris at all times. It's about community standards. They fell last night, I said. There was wind. You remember the wind? Karen's eyes narrowed. It's not my job to monitor the weather, Mr. Vale. It's your responsibility to maintain curb appeal. The board voted unanimously. The board, I repeated. You mean you and your two friends? She stiffened. It's not up for debate. I let her walk off, gripping her clipboard like a saber, but I wasn't letting this go. I had a security camera mounted under the eaves of my garage, motion activated, high res. I'd installed it after Karen claimed my recycling bin was out of code. I didn't trust her then, and I trusted her even less now. I pulled the footage from the night before. Wind kicked up around 10. At precisely 10:17, a gust hit hard and leaves from the neighbor's maple rained down like confetti. My yard had been spotless before that. I made sure of it. I rewound the footage to sunset yesterday. Yup, clean, not a single leaf, so I printed stills. Time-stamped, clear as day. I stapled them to a new letter and walked it straight to the HOA drop box by the clubhouse. I didn't say anything fancy, just disputing fine, see attached evidence, revoke immediately. I figured that'd be the end of it, but the next morning Karen showed up again. This time she wasn't alone. Karen stood at the edge of my driveway again, only this time she wasn't alone. Two men flanked her. One of them was Greg Tolson, the HOA treasurer, a retired insurance adjuster with a suspiciously polished demeanor. The other I hadn't met, but he wore a navy windbreaker with the words Community Compliance Officer embroidered over his chest. The title sounded made up. Mr. Vale, Karen began, her tone clipped. We've reviewed your footage. Unfortunately, video evidence is not listed as an accepted form of dispute under our enforcement procedures. I blinked. You're saying hard proof doesn't count because it's not in your made-up handbook. Greg cleared his throat like he was auditioning for a courtroom drama. The HOA operates under a specific framework, Mr. Vale. Evidence must be submitted through approved channels. That includes inspection reports and signed witness statements, not personal surveillance. I turned to the unknown guy. And you are, he gave a tight nod. Marcus Denton. Contracted compliance officer. I'm here to verify that the violation existed and that the warning was issued appropriately. You're saying you got called out to confirm 3 leaves? I asked. They were scattered across the yard, Denton replied flatly. I documented it. Did you document what time they got there? He didn't answer. Karen jumped in. Mr. Vale, let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. Pay the fine. It's minimal. We're all neighbors here. Really? Because this feels less like neighborhood cooperation and more like a shakedown. Denton stepped forward slightly. Sir, if fines remain unpaid past the 30-day window, the HOA has authority to initiate a lien process against your property. I stared at him. You're threatening to lien my house over a leaf, Greg interjected. It's not about the amount, it's about principle. If we let this go, others will follow. The rules exist for a reason. I didn't say anything. I just turned, walked into my garage, and shut the door behind me. Inside, I pulled up the HOA bylaws I'd downloaded when I bought the place. There it was section 4.6.2 under fines and enforcement. Disputes may be resolved through evidence-based review, including photographic or video documentation, provided it is time-stamped and submitted within 15 days. They just lied to my face. I printed the clause, circled it in red, and added it to my growing file. Then I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years, my sister, Dana. She's a lawyer. Real estate and municipal code, used to work for the county before starting her own firm. I explained what happened, read her the bylaw, and asked her how deep this rabbit hole could go. They're bluffing, she said. If they tried to lien your property under false pretenses, that's fraud. If they knowingly deny valid evidence, that's grounds for civil action. But if this is bigger, if they're doing this to other residents, you're looking at a pattern, class action territory. I froze. You think this is happening to other people? I'd bet on it. That night, I started knocking on doors. I started with my neighbors on either side, Marla, a nurse who worked nights like me, and the Burkes, a retired couple who mostly kept to themselves. Marla looked exhausted as she stood in the doorway, holding a coffee mug that said, "I run on caffeine and chaos." "Leaves?" she said when I asked. "Yeah, I got fined twice. Once for yard clutter, it was a garden hose, and once for unsanitary bins. My trash cans were out for pickup like everyone else's. I paid 'cause I didn't want hassle." The Burkes invited me in. Their kitchen table was covered in envelopes, HOA notices, all unopened. "We just stack 'em," Mr. Burke said. "Too many. They fined us for bird feeders last month, said we were attracting pests." Mrs. Burke added, "We used to go to meetings, but it was always the same 3 people making decisions. No one else got a say." I kept going. 7 houses, 5 similar stories. Fines, threats of liens, and a lot of people too tired or intimidated to push back home. I compiled everything, dates of fines, reasons, amounts, and who signed off on them. Karen's name was on every single one. Then I found something odd. One resident, a single mother named Carla, had a notice that said her dues were past due by over a year. But she swore she'd paid in full every quarter. She even had bank statements to prove it. I compared her records to the HOA ledger. Another neighbor had quietly shared with me Carla's payments weren't listed at all. I called Dana again. "This is serious," she said. "If they're pocketing dues or misreporting payments, that's embezzlement. You need to go to the county auditor's office." "Bring everything." The next day, on my lunch break, I drove to the auditor's office and requested a records inspection under the Homeowners Transparency Act. The clerk, a guy named Theo, reviewed the documents while sipping a thermos of tea. "Interesting," he said after 40 minutes. "This HOA submitted their budget reports late and incomplete. No itemized expenditures, no receipts. That's a violation. And if dues aren't being properly recorded, that's a whole different can of worms." I asked what came next. "If you're willing to file a formal complaint, the county can open a financial review, but you'll need to get more residents involved." So I did. By the end of the week, I'd organized a neighborhood meeting quietly. We met in Carla's backyard, away from the clubhouse where Karen held her little tribunals. Over 20 residents showed up, some with folders of their own. Carla brought a binder thick with payment confirmations. The Burkes had letters going back 3 years. Greg's name appeared more than once, approving late fees that didn't match anyone's due dates. I stood on a patio chair and laid it out. They're not just fining us unfairly, they're manipulating records, misusing funds, and lying about the rules. Dana joined via speakerphone, explaining how we could file an injunction to freeze the HOA's account pending investigation. People started nodding, then clapping. Then someone passed around a sign-up sheet. We had 28 signatures by the end of the night, enough to trigger a recall vote under the HOA charter. But we didn't stop there. The following Monday, I filed the complaint with the county auditor. Dana faxed over a petition for a temporary restraining order to prevent the HOA board from issuing further fines until the investigation concluded. By Wednesday, a notice appeared on the clubhouse door. All HOA actions temporarily suspended pending county review. Karen's golf cart didn't make an appearance that day, or the day after. Then, on Friday morning, a black SUV pulled into the HOA office lot. Two men in county jackets stepped out, one carrying a briefcase, the other a camera. They were there for records. And the locks on the HOA office door were changed by noon. I didn't see Karen until the end of the week. She was standing in her driveway, arms folded, watching as a county official taped a notice to the clubhouse window. She didn't say anything when I walked by. But for the first time since moving in, I saw her without that clipboard. By Saturday, the neighborhood felt different. People were walking their dogs slower, pausing near the clubhouse, whispering by mailboxes. The buzz wasn't about lawn violations anymore, it was about what the county was going to find once they cracked open the HOA's books. I had no idea how deep it would go until Dana called that afternoon. "They're launching a forensic audit," she said. "Full trace of all financial transactions from the past 5 years. The county's bringing in an outside firm to do it." I leaned back on my porch chair, still in scrubs from my overnight shift. "That sounds expensive." "They don't care. They flagged 3 major discrepancies already. Missing dues, unapproved purchases, and 1 payment to a consultant that doesn't exist in any state registry." I rubbed my eyes. "Let me guess, the name on the check, G. Tolson." That evening, I noticed Greg loading boxes into the back of his sedan. Sloppy, rushed. One of the boxes split open, sending a stack of manila folders skidding across the curb. He didn't notice me watching from across the street. The next morning, 2 unmarked cars parked outside his house. A man in a dark vest knocked on his door, badge visible, voice calm but firm. Greg didn't come out right away. When he did, he looked pale and said nothing as the officers entered with a search warrant. By the following Tuesday, the neighborhood newsletter arrived, only this time, it wasn't printed on glossy paper with a sugar-coated headline. It was a plain white sheet, folded in half and hand-delivered. No logo, no HOA branding. The heading read, "Temporary Administrative Oversight Greystone Reserve HOA under County Review." Underneath was a notice from the interim administrator, a woman named Denise Holland, appointed by the county. She wrote that due to an ongoing investigation into misconduct and financial irregularities, the previous board had been suspended indefinitely. She invited residents to a town hall meeting at the local library to discuss the future of the association, share community concerns, and begin the process of electing a new board. That meeting changed everything. Over 70 people packed into the library's community room. Folding chairs were filled. People stood along the back wall. Some were neighbors I hadn't seen in months, teachers, delivery drivers, even the mailman who lived on Oak Ridge. Everyone was fed up. Denise stood at the front, flanked by 2 county officials, and explained what they'd found so far. More than $30,000 in unaccounted funds, falsified maintenance contracts, a second bank account opened under the HOA's name but not listed in any official filings. Greg had signed for it. Karen had approved transfers. And a third board member, Elaine from the end of the cul-de-sac, had notarized the paperwork under a different name. Gasps echoed across the room. Someone cursed under their breath. Then Denise dropped the real bomb. There's also evidence that certain board members illegally levied fines as a means of financial coercion, targeting residents who were less likely to contest them, particularly shift workers, seniors, and foreign-born homeowners. The room was dead silent. A man near the front raised his hand. "What happens now?" Denise didn't sugarcoat it. "The county has referred the case to the district attorney. Formal charges are pending. At minimum, we're looking at embezzlement and fraud, possibly racketeering, depending on how far it goes." I looked around the room. People weren't surprised anymore, they were furious. Another hand shot up. "What about the fines we already paid?" Denise nodded. "If the DA confirms the funds were misused, you'll all be eligible for restitution. We'll push for full reimbursement." A woman near the back stood, holding an envelope. "I sold my car to pay off liens they threatened me with. Can they get that back? We're working on freezing all assets tied to the previous board. If it was used to pay fabricated fines, we'll do everything we can to recover it." After the meeting, people lingered in clusters. They weren't just angry, they were organizing. Plans formed on the spot. A committee for temporary oversight. A review panel for all past violations. Someone even volunteered to audit common area repairs from the last 3 years. That night, I walked home with a strange feeling in my chest. I hadn't planned to lead anything. I just wanted to be left alone. But somehow, I'd become the guy people turned to when they needed clarity or proof, or just someone who didn't flinch when a clipboard showed up. I got home, poured a glass of water, and opened my laptop. More emails were coming in, neighbors forwarding old notices, bank records, even photos of contractors who never showed up. One woman sent a scanned invoice for emergency sidewalk sealing that had been charged to her after a minor rainstorm. The contractor's name: Denton Property Solutions. Marcus Denton, the so-called compliance officer. I forwarded everything to Dana. The next morning, she called with an edge in her voice I hadn't heard before. "I just spoke to the investigator," she said. "Denton's company doesn't exist. There's no business license, no insurance, nothing. And guess who endorsed his payment vouchers?" I didn't answer. "Karen, with Greg as the witness. You're looking at a coordinated scheme. Fraudulent citations, fake contractors, fake invoices, and coercive fines." I stepped onto my porch barefoot, watching the sunrise. The air was still. Everything was quiet, but the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Dana continued, "They're issuing arrest warrants today, all 3 of them. The county's coordinating with the sheriff's office. This isn't just administrative anymore, it's criminal." Around noon, 3 sheriff's cruisers arrived at different ends of the neighborhood. By then, word had gotten out. People lined the sidewalks, not jeering, not cheering, just watching. Greg was the first to be let out. Hands cuffed, head down, no resistance. Next came Elaine. She tried to argue, but the officers didn't respond. She kept glancing toward the clubhouse as if someone might come out and defend her. Finally, Karen. She was in her front yard, watering begonias, pretending not to notice the cruiser pulling up. When the deputies approached, she dropped the hose and tried to walk inside, but they were already between her and the door. I couldn't hear what she said, but her face turned blotchy and she backed up slowly, hands raised. They cuffed her without incident. No one clapped, no one shouted. The silence was heavier than any applause. Later that evening, Denise returned to post a new notice. "Special elections scheduled, board nominations open." I wasn't planning on running, but people started showing up at my door again, not with complaints this time, but with ideas, suggestions, requests. One guy brought me a hand-drawn map showing which sidewalks flooded during storms. Someone else brought homemade cookies and a petition to build a community garden on the empty lot near the entrance. I still didn't want to be in charge. But I realized something else. Maybe we didn't need anyone in charge. Maybe we just needed people who listened, who shared the load, who didn't think a clipboard made them royalty. The next week, the election happened by paper ballot. 3 new board members were chosen, all volunteers from the community. None of them had ever served before, and not one of them owned a golf cart. The clubhouse reopened for the first time in months. No more locked doors, no more surveillance. Just neighbors meeting over coffee, planning a block party, talking about painting the benches at the playground and the lawn. Yeah, there were still leaves sometimes, but now nobody cared, because we all knew when the wind blew, it didn't discriminate. It hit every yard the same way. The morning after the arrests, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. It wasn't official, just a torn piece of notebook paper folded neatly in half. On it, in careful handwriting, were 3 words. "Thank you, Quinton." No signature, no return address, just that. I sat behind the wheel for a long minute, letting the silence settle. It wasn't the victory that hit me, it was the quiet that followed. By the end of that week, the county had installed a temporary administrator inside the old HOA office, and the front windows were no longer covered. Through the glass, you could see Denise at a desk, sorting through boxes of ledgers, receipts, and handwritten notes. On Thursday, I stopped by to drop off a copy of the neighborhood's petition to reevaluate the HOA's budget allocations during the last 3 years. Denise invited me inside. "I've never seen a community rally this fast," she said, running a highlighter down a spreadsheet. "Most neighborhoods take months to recover from something like this." "We didn't have the luxury," I said. She looked up. "You know, there's something I think you should see." She stood from her desk and opened a locked drawer. From it, she pulled out a thin manila folder and handed it to me. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a scanned letter, dated last year. It had been sent to the HOA board by a former resident, a man named Elias Navarro. The letter detailed a formal complaint. Elias said he'd been issued 4 separate fines in 1 month, all for vague infractions like improper mulch density and inconsistent fence tone. He accused the board of targeting him after he refused to donate to a beautification fund that had no official approval. He cited harassment and had attached photos of his property showing nothing visibly wrong. He sold his house 2 weeks after this letter was sent, Denise said. Moved out of state, no forwarding address. What happened to his complaint? Denise shook her head. They shredded it. We found the fragments in a bag labeled MISC. Recycling behind the clubhouse, we had to reconstruct it. She pulled out another folder. This is what triggered the deeper audit. Once we realized they'd destroyed resident correspondence, the DA upgraded the charges. Destruction of records, I guessed, obstruction, and evidence tampering. They're adding it to the filing. I stared at the letter again. It had a quiet sort of desperation to it. Neat lines, polite tone, but you could read the frustration in the way he had underlined his sentence. I have done nothing wrong. I folded the letter back up and handed it to her. Was this the only one? I asked. No, we've found 8 so far. Residents who were pushed out by fabricated infractions. Some of them were behind on payments, others were just too vocal. We think the board was systematically forcing out dissenters. Why? Denise picked up another document and laid it flat. It was a zoning map. 3 properties were highlighted in orange, because they were trying to purchase adjacent parcels, she said. Under the HOA's name, the board had plans to expand the development, and they needed unanimous board approval to authorize the land deals. Anyone who resisted. Harassed until they left, I leaned over the map. This was never about leaves or fences, it was about control. Denise nodded. They were turning the neighborhood into a personal investment portfolio. Back outside, the sky had turned overcast. I walked past 3 kids drawing chalk arrows on the sidewalk, pointing toward the playground. One of them looked up and asked if I wanted to play tag. I told him I was too slow, and he grinned before running off with his friends. That weekend, the interim board met in public for the first time. They set up folding chairs on the clubhouse lawn and invited the entire neighborhood. People brought folding tables, snacks, even one of those giant orange coolers filled with lemonade. The meeting wasn't about rules, it was about rebuilding trust. A man named Jerome, a retired transit coordinator, stood at the front and proposed a rotating community council instead of a fixed board. No one should sit in that seat for too long, he said. Power goes stale when it doesn't move. A woman in her 60s named Rosa volunteered to lead a financial transparency group. Every dollar in and out will be posted monthly, she said. No exceptions. By the end of the afternoon, 5 committees had formed, each one focused on a different task: infrastructure, fairness, budgeting, landscaping, and community engagement. No titles, no hierarchy, just neighbors figuring things out together. No one mentioned Karen or Greg. Or Elaine. It was like the neighborhood had collectively decided to move forward without dragging the past behind it, but the past wasn't quite done. 2 weeks later, I received a subpoena. I was called to testify at the preliminary hearing. Not just about my fine, but the evidence I had compiled, the footage, and the documents I'd gathered from residents. I dressed in the only suit I owned and drove downtown on a rainy Tuesday. Inside the courthouse, the air was cold and sterile. Dana met me out front and walked me through what to expect. Just tell them what happened, as clearly as you can, no speculation, just facts. When they called my name, I stepped up to the stand. The courtroom was quiet, the judge taking notes with a pen that clicked between every sentence. The prosecutor asked me to explain the timeline of events, how the fine was issued, how I responded, and how I discovered the HOA's refusal to honor their own bylaws. Then they showed the security footage. The timestamp glowed in the corner as leaves drifted down in the dark. The room was still while it played. Next, they moved to the documentation, the altered ledgers, the missing dues, the fake contractor. All of it built piece by piece. The final slide was the zoning map, the one showing the properties the board had tried to manipulate into acquisition. The defense didn't say much. They tried to challenge the authenticity of the footage, but it had already been verified by the county's forensics team. They questioned whether I had a personal vendetta, but the judge shut that down quickly. "You're not on trial here, Mr. Vale," the judge said. "You may step down." As I walked back to my seat, I caught a glimpse of Karen at the defense table. She looked smaller than I remembered. No sunglasses, no clipboard, just a woman staring at the floor, hands folded in her lap. By the end of the day, the judge ruled there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. The charges stood: conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, obstruction, and abuse of fiduciary duty. Outside, Dana clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You did good," she said. Now it's up to the system. But the system wasn't the only thing working. Back home, the neighborhood had shifted. The kids who used to ride their bikes in pairs now roamed in groups. People waved at each other again. Lawns weren't perfect, but they were lived-in garden gnomes, mismatched chairs, a flamingo or two, and in the middle of it all, a bulletin board had been mounted near the mailboxes. No glass case, no lock, just cork and tacks. Flyers for local babysitters, a lost cat poster, a notice about a weekend potluck. One night, I found a folded sheet pinned to the board. It was a copy of the very first fine I had received, the one for the lawn debris. Someone had written across it in red marker, "Never again." I didn't take it down. I just stood there for a moment, watching the wind rustle the corners. The wind, as it turned out, still blew through the neighborhood. Leaves still fell. But now, when they did, no one panicked, no one patrolled. People swept them up when they had time, or didn't, because now the neighborhood understood something they hadn't before. Order didn't come from control. It came from care, from listening, from the refusal to let silence be mistaken for consent. And I finally had peace. Not because the clipboard was gone, but because the community had reclaimed its voice, and it was louder than any fine could ever be.